The wind howled like starving wolves beyond the frozen windows of Nivik. Snow lashed the timbered cottages in vicious sheets, building thick drifts against doors, burying fences and wells, smothering the village beneath a suffocating white. Inside the heart of the village, the old stone church, the air was thick with the scent of candle wax, damp wool, and fear. The great iron stove at the back glowed dimly, its heat pitiful against the vast cold creeping through the cracks of the ancient stone walls. Around it, villagers huddled together, bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their breath misting into ghostly puffs. No one spoke. The storm had cut them off from the outside world 2 days ago. Now, on Christmas Eve, it was as if the rest of Norway, the rest of the world, had ceased to exist. The storm wasn't natural. They all felt it, deep in their bones, an old primal terror stirring beneath the conscious mind. This was not just a blizzard, it was something else, something waiting. At the front of the church, Pastor Edvard adjusted his glasses with shaking fingers. His Bible lay open on the lectern, but the words blurred before his eyes. His throat felt raw, and not just from the cold. He knew why they had gathered, not just for prayer. It was tradition, yes, a Christmas Eve Mass. But deep down, every soul in Nivik, all 83 of them, he had come for protection. They needed the church's old stone walls. They needed each other. They needed something, anything, to hold back the darkness. Edvard's voice cracked the silence. "Let us bow our heads," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let us pray." The congregation stirred, bowing heads, pressing trembling hands together. Mothers clutched children tightly to their chests. Old men gripped worn rosaries until their knuckles turned white. Edvard closed his eyes, speaking the ancient words from memory. "Lord, we ask not only for joy tonight, but for shelter, for your shield against what moves beyond these walls." A low groan rattled the rafters. Some said it was the wind, some knew better. From his place near the back, old Henrik Olsen, the village blacksmith, now stooped and silver-haired, muttered under his breath, words not from the Bible. Words, Edvard realized with a cold jolt. The old protective prayers, the kind the elders used to whisper when the forest grew too silent. A baby whimpered, its cries muffled against its mother's shoulder. She rocked it gently, her eyes darting to the darkened windows, as if expecting to see a face peering in. The candles flickered. Somewhere high above in the steeple, the great bell swayed in the wind, groaning on its iron chain. Pastor Edvard forced himself to continue. "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at his faith. Outside, the storm raged on, not abating, not moving, as if it had settled over them, as if it was watching. The minutes crawled by. Every creak of the wood, every shudder of the walls made the congregation flinch. Time lost meaning. Midnight was close. The bells would toll soon. Edvard closed the Bible, stepping down from the altar to join his people. No longer a shepherd above his flock. Now just another trembling soul among them. He took a seat beside Marta Everson, the oldest living woman in Nivik. A woman who claimed to remember things others dismissed as superstition. Her eyes, cloudy with age, stared straight ahead. Her lips moved in silent prayer. Or was it something else? Edvard opened his mouth to ask, but a sudden silence choked the room. The wind outside stopped, dead still. The candles froze, their flames unnaturally still, no longer dancing with the drafts. In that terrible quiet, every heart beat loud enough to hear. And then, it came. A sound that seemed to shake the very stones of the church. Boom! A knock, heavy, slow, like something massive striking the oak doors with the flat of its hand. The congregation froze. No one dared breathe. Another knock. Boom! The heavy door trembled in its frame. Pastor Edvard rose to his feet, feeling his knees betray him with a tremble. One last knock. Boom! 3 times. And then silence. Marta's voice, brittle and thin, broke the air. "It's him," she whispered. The others turned to her, eyes wide with terror. "The Red Father." Pastor Edvard swallowed hard, tasting the copper tang of fear on his tongue. Outside, something massive shifted through the snow. Waiting. The bells would toll soon, and Nevik had forgotten the old ways, forgotten the price. The great oak doors shuddered again under an unseen fist. Pastor Edvard stood frozen at the head of the church, the blood draining from his face. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to run. The storm outside was a wall of white death, and whatever stood at the door was worse than the cold. The villagers huddled together, whispering frantic prayers, clinging to one another. Somewhere a child began to sob openly, the sound sharp and high in the frozen air. Boom! Another blow rattling the iron hinges. A deep groan sounded from the wood, the bolts barely holding. "Stay calm," Edvard shouted, but his voice cracked. Too thin, too weak. A few of the younger men, strong farmhands, rough woodsmen, moved toward the doors, clutching makeshift weapons, axes, iron pokers, heavy stones torn from the crumbling walls. Gunnar Eriksson, the butcher, barked orders. "Block the doors! Use the pews!" The men scrambled to obey, dragging the heavy wooden benches across the stone floor with desperate scraping sounds. A small mountain of furniture rose against the entrance, trembling with each new knock. Marta Iverson sat motionless in her pew, whispering feverishly to herself. 3 knocks, she said, always 3. An invitation, not a demand. Edvard turned to her sharply. "What do you mean?" Marta's cloudy eyes stared through him, as if seeing something far older than the church's stone walls. "If you answer, you let it in," she whispered. The pastor's stomach twisted. Outside, the blizzard began again. But it wasn't the chaotic roar of a natural storm. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as if the very wind itself was breathing. A heavy thump sounded from the back of the church. Heads snapped around. The church had other doors. The vestry, the cellar, weak points. "We must seal everything," Edvard shouted. "No one opens a door, no one leaves." Panic rippled through the congregation. Families clutched together, shielding the young and the old, the pregnant, the sick. The candles along the walls flickered wildly, some snuffing out entirely. Shadows stretched and twisted, and then a new sound. Not a knock, a scrape. Something sharp dragging slowly across the outer walls. A claw, a horn. The stone sang under its touch, high and thin like a scream trapped in ice. Inside, the temperature plummeted. Breath hung in thick clouds. Frost crackled along the stained glass windows. Something was here, and it was playing with them. Edvard clutched the worn wooden cross around his neck until the edges bit into his palm. He turned to the villagers. "Sing," he said hoarsely. The people stared at him in disbelief. "Sing," he shouted. "The old carols, loud." A few hesitant voices lifted, thin, wavering. "Dalig Jordan, fair is the earth." The old Christmas hymn rose into the frozen air. Others joined, their voices trembling. But together they grew stronger, filling the church with the ancient song. Prächtig Guds Himmel, glorious is God's heaven. The scraping outside paused. The storm roared louder, furious. For a moment, just a moment, hope flickered. And then a window exploded inward with a shattering boom. A blizzard of glass and snow burst into the church, extinguishing half the candles instantly. People screamed, shielding their faces. Standing in the wreckage was a figure, tall, draped in heavy crimson robes, crowned with twisted black horns. The Red Father, a hideous mask, covered his face. A deer's skull, yellowed with age, the empty sockets staring into the souls of everyone present. In one clawed hand, he gripped a crooked shepherd's staff, blackened and smoking at the tip. In the other, nothing yet. He moved with unnatural speed. In 2 strides, he was among them. Chaos erupted, screaming, trampling, shoving. Pastor Edvard could only watch, frozen in horror, as the Red Father's claw closed around a girl, Anna Jurgensen, barely 16, a flower of the village. She screamed once, a piercing, soul-tearing sound, and then she was lifted effortlessly into the air. Her body convulsed violently, and then, without warning, she crumpled, limp, her head lolling grotesquely backward. The Red Father turned. Snow and blood mingled at his feet. And then, Just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone, carried back into the white storm through the shattered window, taking Anna with him, leaving only a single crimson feather floating down onto the altar steps. Silence fell, shattered only by the soft sobbing of Anna's mother, collapsed on the stone floor. Pastor Edvard stumbled forward, scooping up the red feather. It was warm to the touch, wet. He recoiled, his hands streaked with blood. Around him, the congregation stood stunned, their faces slack with terror. The Red Father had returned, and he had only just begun. The church was no longer a place of refuge. It was a tomb waiting to be filled. The villagers crowded together under the shattered windows and flickering candles, their faces pale and hollow. Snow drifted in through the broken glass, settling across pews and altar alike, as if the world itself was reclaiming this sacred ground. Pastor Edvard stood clutching the blood-stained feather, his mind spinning. Anna was gone, and whatever had taken her was not done. Beside him, old Marta Iverson rocked back and forth in her seat, her mouth moving soundlessly, her cloudy eyes glazed and distant. Edvard knelt before her. "Marta," he said softly, gripping her gnarled hands, "tell us, what is this? What's happening?" Around them, the villagers leaned in, desperate for answers. Marta's lips trembled. "You fools," she croaked, her voice a papery whisper, barely louder than the howling wind. We forgot what was owed." Edvard frowned. "What do you mean?" Marta's eyes slowly focused on him, and for a moment they shone with terrible clarity. "The Red Father," she said, as if speaking his name, summoned cold fingers down every spine. "He is no myth, no fairy tale. He is real. He was always real." A long silence. "You must understand," Marta continued, her voice strengthening. "Navik was not always so lucky. Centuries ago, when the winters were crueler and the forests darker, we were starving. Crops failed. Cattle died. People froze in their beds." She paused, swallowing hard. And then one Christmas Eve, he came. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Out of the storm he walked, cloaked in crimson, crowned with horns. He brought warmth, food, firewood that never burned out, seeds that grew even in frost. Marta squeezed Edvard's hand, nails digging into his skin. But he did not give these gifts for free. Another gust of icy wind rattled the broken window panes, as if to punctuate her words. "The Red Father demanded a sacrifice," Marta said. "Every year, on Christmas Eve, a soul freely given, offered under the old yew tree at the edge of the village. The old yew, everyone knew it, a gnarled, blackened thing older than the village itself, twisted against the gray sky. For 3 centuries, Marta whispered, the village kept the pact quietly, secretly, a life for life, and in return we flourished while other towns withered away." Pastor Edvard staggered back, stunned. "You're telling me," he said hoarsely, "that every Christmas Eve someone was murdered? As an offering?" "No," Marta snapped. "Not murdered, given, willingly. The old, the sick, the condemned, those ready to pass from this world. They understood. They gave themselves to protect the village." A bitter smile tugged at her lips. "But modern times make us forget, don't they? We have supermarkets now, hospitals, phones. We forgot the old ways, laughed at the old warnings." Tears welled in Marta's ancient eyes. "And now," she said, "he has come to collect what is owed." The congregation erupted into shouts. "This is madness! Old superstitions. We don't believe in that anymore." But even as they cried out, their faces betrayed the truth. They did believe. Deep down in their bones, they always had. Pastor Edvard raised his hands for silence. If what you're saying is true," he said, struggling for calm, "then what does he want now?" Marta's smile was bleak. "Payment," she said simply, "what we owe him. But no longer will he wait for a willing offering. He will take what he desires." She looked toward the broken window where Anna had vanished. And he has begun. Across the church, mothers clutched their children tighter. Men gripped axes and knives with white-knuckled fear. The Red Father was not just a fairy tale whispered to frighten naughty children. He was real, and he was hungry. The old bells in the steeple groaned against the storm, creaking on their iron chains. One bell swung free for a moment, tolling once, a low, mournful sound that seemed to shake the very stones of the church. Doom, Pastor Edvard ran a shaking hand through his hair. There had to be a way to stop this, to save them, but deep down a terrible certainty gnawed at him. The Red Father had waited centuries. He would not be denied now. The hours after Anna's disappearance passed in a fevered nightmare. No one dared leave the church. The villagers huddled together like cattle awaiting slaughter, their breath misting in the frigid air, whispering prayers too old to be heard by any god that might still care. Pastor Edvard patrolled the dark aisles between the pews, iron candle holder in hand, his heart a constant drumbeat of fear. Outside, the storm raged like a living beast, snow hammering against the church walls with ceaseless fury. Every so often, he thought he heard something, footsteps crunching across the snow, a faint scratching at the boarded windows, a low, guttural chuckle carried on the wind. Each time he paused, holding his breath. Each time, there was nothing. Inside the church, the villagers spoke in hushed tones. Some begged Edvard to lead a prayer circle. Others sharpened knives or fashioned crude weapons from broken furniture. Most simply sat, staring at the doors, waiting for the horror to return. Hours dragged by. Night fell like a heavy curtain. Candles guttered and died, leaving only a few flickering patches of light. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, creeping closer with every heartbeat. It was just past midnight when the second disappearance happened. Little Linnea Olsen, no more than 7 years old, had curled up beside her mother, sleeping under a moth-eaten woolen blanket. Her tiny fingers clutched a wooden doll. Her mother, brittle with exhaustion, dozed off for just a moment. When she awoke, Linnea was gone. The blanket lay undisturbed. The doll sat where Linnea's hand had dropped it. And there, on the cracked stone floor, was another crimson feather, this one larger, wet with something dark that was not melted snow. The mother's scream tore through the church like a blade, slicing open the fragile calm. People leapt to their feet. Torches were lit. The aisles and corners were searched frantically. But it was futile. Linnea had simply vanished, just like Anna, and the doors and windows were still barricaded. There was no way in, no way out. The Red Father didn't need such things. Panic spread like wildfire. How did it get inside? Nowhere is safe. We have to leave. We have to run. Old Marta Iverson stood slowly, leaning heavily on her cane. You can't run from a debt, she said in a voice that cut through the shouting. You can only pay it. Edvard struggled to regain control. Calm yourselves, he bellowed, his voice hoarse. Panicking will not save us. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The Red Father was toying with them, picking them off one by one, proving that no amount of walls or prayers could protect them. The villagers tightened their barricades. Men and women took turns keeping watch. They told themselves they could keep the children safe if they just stayed awake, stayed vigilant. They lied to themselves. Before dawn, 2 more would vanish. A young couple, Eric and Maya, newlyweds barely into their 20s. They had huddled together against the cold, hands entwined. When morning came, there was only an imprint in the snow where their bodies had been, and a trail of crimson feathers leading out into the blizzard. The old bells in the church tower tolled once, low and sorrowful, though no one had pulled the rope. The sound rattled the bones of every soul still alive inside those crumbling walls. The Red Father had made his presence known, and he was only just beginning. At dawn, the storm relented just enough for the gray light to seep through the shattered windows. The snow had piled halfway up the church walls. The world beyond looked dead, frozen solid under endless white. Pastor Edvard stood before the altar, hollow-eyed, as he counted the faces that remained. Too few, far too few, children clung to their parents. The able-bodied gathered weapons, axes, hammers, hunting knives, even broken pew legs sharpened into crude spears. A meeting was called, not to pray, not anymore, but to fight. "The Red Father hunts us like sheep," Edvard said grimly. "We cannot wait for him to pick us off one by one. We must go to him." Murmurs ran through the crowd. "Go out there? In the storm? We'll freeze before we find him." Marta's voice cracked through the noise. "You won't have to find him," she said. "He'll be waiting." They formed a plan, if it could be called that. Half the men and women would form a hunting party. They would track the trail of crimson feathers leading out into the woods. The others, the children, the sick, the old, would remain inside, under guard. It was suicide. They knew it, but to stay was to die anyway. Wrapped in every scrap of warmth they could find, the hunting party prepared to venture into the storm. Pastor Edvard led them, his iron candle holder now wrapped in strips of cloth and doused in oil, forming a makeshift torch. With a final prayer whispered under his breath, he shoved open the heavy church doors. Snow spilled inward like a breaking wave. The villagers stepped into the frozen hell. The trail was easy enough to find, a line of crushed snow and scattered crimson feathers winding into the skeletal forest. They followed it in grim silence, their feet crunching heavily. The woods closed around them, skeletal trees groaning under the weight of ice. The world was deathly quiet. No birds, no animals, only the hiss of falling snow and the soft, mournful sobbing of the wind. After an hour, they found the first sign. Anna's scarf, torn and frozen to a tree branch. A crimson feather pinned to it like a mocking brooch. Another hour, a hand protruding from a drift. Fingers blue and stiff, nails torn and bloody. Someone retched. They pressed on. The trail grew stranger. The feathers forming strange patterns in the snow, spirals and runes none of them could understand. Then, movement. Between the trees, a flicker of crimson. Pastor Edvard raised his torch high. "Show yourself," he cried. Silence. Then, without warning, the snow itself seemed to erupt. Figures surged from beneath the drifts, wrapped in tattered red cloaks, faces hidden behind masks carved from blackened wood. The taken. The villagers screamed. The Red Father's new servants fell upon them with inhuman speed and strength. Axes swung, knives flashed. Men and women fought with the desperation of the doomed. Edvard bashed one creature with his torch, the flames licking at its face. It barely noticed. It lunged, knocking him into the snow. The world blurred into a frenzy of teeth, claws, and screams. Blood sprayed across the drifts, staining the pure white a vivid, hideous red. One by one, the villagers fell. Gunnar Eriksson, throat torn out. Young Sophie, dragged screaming into the trees. Old Henrik, his hammer raised in defiance until he was pulled down beneath a swarm of red-cloaked figures. Edvard fought like a man possessed, swinging the iron torch wildly, the flames flaring with each desperate blow. He managed to drive a path through the case, grabbing Marta by the arm and pulling her toward a narrow ravine. "This way," he shouted. A handful of survivors stumbled after him, battered, bloodied, broken. Behind them, the taken howled like wolves. The survivors tumbled down the ravine, half sliding, half falling into a narrow gully shielded by overhanging rocks. For a few blessed moments, they were hidden, safe. They collapsed into the snow, gasping for air. Pastor Edvard looked around. Only 6 remained, 6 from nearly 30. Marta's face was grim. "You saw it, didn't you?" she rasped. Edvard nodded. In the heart of the ambush, watching with hollow, pitiless eyes, had stood the Red Father himself. A tall figure wrapped in crimson, crowned with antlers of black ice. He had not lifted a finger. He had merely watched as his children slaughtered the living. And worst of all, he had smiled. A terrible, empty smile that promised the worst was yet to come. Edvard wiped the blood from his face, his hands trembling. He knew now. There would be no mercy, no escape, only blood on the snow. The survivors huddled beneath the overhang, shivering in silence. Above them, the blizzard howled, carrying the distant screams of the dying. Pastor Edvard bound a gash on his forearm, with a strip torn from his robe, wincing. The blood had frozen almost instantly, turning the cloth into a stiff, red-crusted band. Marta sat apart from the others, staring into the swirling snow with glassy, haunted eyes. Edvard approached her carefully. "Marta," he said, his voice low. "You knew this was coming." She didn't look at him. Her gnarled fingers clutched a small pouch tied around her neck, a pouch that smelled faintly of old herbs and grave dirt. "I warned them," she said finally, voice brittle as thin ice. "Years ago, every winter, I told them." She turned, fixing Edvard with eyes as sharp as broken glass. But no one listens to the old woman. Edvard crouched before her. "Tell me," he said. "Please." Marta closed her eyes, and when she spoke, it was like a dam bursting. "The Red Father is not new," she said. "He is older than this village. Older than the stones beneath our feet. Older than the gods you pray to." She pulled the pouch from her neck and dumped its contents into the snow. Inside were fragments of something dark and brittle. Shards of an ancient mask. "Long ago, when the first settlers came here," Marta continued, "they found these land barren and cursed. Crops would not grow. Animals would not breed. Children were stillborn." The wind whistled through the rocks like a voice, urging her on. "So they made a pact," she whispered. "In the heart of the old woods, they called something up from the deep places of the earth. Something that promised them life, in exchange for blood." Edvard's stomach twisted. "A sacrifice," he said. Marta nodded. "Every winter, on the longest night, a child was given, taken to the old yew tree and left as an offering." She spat into the snow. "For generations, it kept the Red Father fed, and in return, the village thrived." "But we stopped," Edvard said, his voice barely audible. "When the new church was built," Marta said bitterly, "when you came with your bright prayers and your iron bells, you told them they were free of old sins." She leaned forward, her breath misting between them. "But debts don't disappear, Pastor. They wait." Edvard reeled back, horrified. "You knew," he said. "You knew this would happen." Marta's laugh was a broken, joyless thing. "I hoped it wouldn't," she said. "I hoped your God was stronger." She looked away, voice trembling. "But hope is a fool's fire. It burns bright and dies cold." The survivors around them listened in silence, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. One of them, a young man named Anders, stood abruptly. "So what do we do?" he demanded. "Offer another child? Another Anna? Another Linnea?" "No," Marta said sharply. "The Red Father is angry now. It's not enough to offer a child. He wants what he was promised." Edvard's throat tightened. "And what was promised?" he asked, dreading the answer. Marta met his gaze, her face full of terrible certainty. "All of us." The wind screamed overhead as if in confirmation. "All debts must be paid. With blood." The survivors stared at one another, the terrible realization sinking in like a blade. There was no saving the village, only a chance, a slim, desperate chance, to bargain, to offer something even the Red Father could not refuse. But what could match the blood of a village? Edvard stood slowly, feeling the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders. If salvation was to be won, it would require a sacrifice beyond imagining. And he knew deep in his bones that the price would fall on him. The storm raged as Pastor Edvard and the remaining survivors made their way through the thick, treacherous woods, the blizzard howling like 100 wolves. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself was pressing down on them, urging them to turn back. Edvard felt the weight of Marta's revelation hanging over him like a noose. He had known they were in danger, but never like this, never this deep. In the distance, the sound of the wind was broken by something else. A low, deep hum, a pulse in the air, and then they saw it. The clearing, the heart of the old woods, the yew tree, massive, twisted form loomed above them, its bark as black as coal, its gnarled branches reaching like claws into the storm-dark sky. Under its shadow, the snow seemed to vanish, swallowed by the ancient, cursed earth beneath it. The group stopped at the edge of the clearing. Edvard's breath caught in his throat as he looked up at the tree. It was alive, in a way that no tree should be. The branches stirred unnaturally in the wind, as if they had a mind of their own, and in the deep crevices of the bark there seemed to be eyes, black, infinite, unblinking. Marta stepped forward, her face pale, drawn but unyielding. "This is where it began," she whispered, her voice trembling, "and this is where it must end." The others lingered behind her, fear in their eyes. Edvard's hand tightened around the iron torch, now reduced to little more than a charred stick. He could feel the Red Father's presence in the air, a weight that seemed to crush the very breath from his lungs. And then, from the darkness beneath the tree, something stirred. A shadow, impossibly tall, moved into view. The Red Father, he was more terrible than Edvard had ever imagined. His body was cloaked in tattered robes of crimson, as if they had been woven from the blood of ages. His face, or what could be seen of it, was a twisted, ancient mask of bone and antlers, crowned with black ice that seemed to throb with a dark, malevolent energy. His eyes, if they could be called that, were empty, hollow pits that stared into Edvard's very soul. The air grew colder still as the Red Father's towering form emerged fully from the shadows. He stood before them, silent, unblinking, waiting. Edvard swallowed, the words caught in his throat. "You have come," the Red Father said at last, his voice deep, hollow, like a wind whispering through the forgotten graves of the earth. "I see you have brought your offering." Edvard felt the ground beneath him tremble. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the storm, it was something far darker, something older. The villagers shifted uneasily. Edvard could see the terror in their eyes. They had come this far, but now the reality of what they faced was undeniable. It wasn't just a monster. It wasn't just the killing of a few. It was the end of them all. "You," Edvard's voice cracked as he looked up at the Red Father. "You want all of us." The Red Father's smile, if it could be called that, was slow, deliberate. "Yes," he replied. "All debts must be paid, Pastor. All debts, in time, are collected. But your village, has been a most delicious offering. So much blood, so much fear, so many souls." Edvard took a step forward, his knees shaking, but his resolve firming. "What do you want from us? What do you want from me?" The Red Father tilted his head, as if savoring the question. "I want the final payment," he said softly. "The final bargain." Edvard felt his heart hammer in his chest. He knew this was coming, the inevitable end. "You want me," he said, his voice a whisper. "Ah," the Red Father intoned, stepping closer, his antlers casting long, twisted shadows across the snow. "Yes, you are the shepherd, and the shepherd must always pay the price." The villagers behind Edvard gasped in horror. Edvard's mind raced, heart pounding against his ribcage. He looked at Marta, who stood silent, her eyes brimming with sorrow. She had known this moment was coming. She had always known. The Red Father's eyes locked onto Edvard's, and the air thickened with a suffocating pressure. The storm seemed to hush, the winds dying down as if holding their breath. There was no way out, no escape. "You want me to sacrifice myself," Edvard said quietly, "to become part of your harvest." The Red Father smiled again, slow and sickening. "Yes," he said, "but not just you, Pastor. You are the key. You are the one who must unlock the door. And once the blood flows, everything will be mine." Edvard felt the weight of the decision press down on him. His mind raced through the faces of those who had already been lost: Anna, Linnea, Gunnar, Henrik, Sophie, and all the others. He had promised to protect them, to save them. But now he was faced with an impossible choice. One life, one soul, to save them all. But at what cost? The wind picked up again, biting through the layers of clothing, howling like a chorus of lost souls. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones, but it wasn't the storm that chilled him. It was the choice. the dark bargain before him. The villagers behind him watched, waiting for his decision. There was no time left. "You must choose, Pastor," the Red Father said softly. "One life, one soul, yours." Edvard's heart twisted in his chest, and then, in the quiet of that moment, he knew what he had to do. With a final glance at the villagers, at those he had failed to protect, he stepped forward. "I will do it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The Red Father's smile stretched impossibly wide. Good. The price had been paid. The world seemed to stop. The moment Edvard made his decision, the air thickened, pressing down on him with a suffocating weight. The villagers behind him stared, their faces pale and hollow-eyed, as if they had just witnessed the final nail in a coffin. Edvard could hear nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. The Red Father stepped closer, his form towering over Edvard, his antlers casting long, terrifying shadows across the snow. His presence was suffocating, as if the very essence of the woods, of the earth itself, had wrapped around Edvard like an iron cage. "You understand the cost, Pastor?" The Red Father's voice was a low, mocking whisper, drifting through the storm like a serpent's hiss. Edvard nodded, his throat felt tight. The words lodged there, but he forced them out. "I understand," he said, his voice trembling despite himself. "But this is the only way." The Red Father's eyes, hollow pits of darkness, bore into him. "Very well," the Red Father said softly. "The offering must be made." Edvard swallowed, his mouth dry as dust. The villagers had not moved. They were frozen in place, caught between the horror of the moment and the impossible reality that was unfolding before them. The storm raged above them, snowflakes swirling like a blinding curtain. But within the clearing, the world had grown eerily still. The tree, that massive ancient yew, seemed to pulse with an unnatural life, its twisted branches groaning and shifting, its roots clawing deep into the earth. The Red Father raised a hand, his fingers long and gnarled like ancient branches. He pointed toward the ground, and the snow beneath them cracked open with an audible snap, revealing a dark, blackened hole in the earth. It was as though the ground itself was a mouth, opening wide to swallow them all. "The offering must be placed," the Red Father said, his voice reverberating through the clearing like a thunderclap. "The soul must be given." Edvard's heart raced as he approached the yawning abyss in the earth. He could feel the pull, the cold, primal hunger of the Red Father seeping into his very bones. The world around him blurred, and he had to fight to stay grounded, to focus. "You will take what is owed," Edvard said, trying to steady his voice. "And then you will leave." The Red Father laughed, the sound cold and deep. "I am the one who decides when the deal is done, Pastor." Edvard's hands shook as he reached beneath his cloak, pulling out a small, crude knife, a blade he had taken from one of the fallen villagers. The metal felt like ice in his hand, and for a moment he wondered if it would slip from his fingers, leaving him empty-handed. But there was no time. The Red Father extended his hand, his fingers twisted, waiting. Edvard steeled himself. The knife bit into his palm. A warm, thick liquid spilled out. His blood. Dark and pulsing, it flowed down his arm and dripped onto the snow, the crimson streaks standing stark against the whiteness. The wind howled louder now, whipping around him like an angry beast. The Red Father moved closer, his towering form bending down, looming over Edvard. His eyes gleamed with hunger. "Your blood is the final part of the offering," the Red Father murmured, his voice thick with satisfaction. "But there is more." The ground beneath Edvard's feet trembled, the earth quivering like something alive. The snow around him began to darken, as though it was absorbing his blood, pulling it deep into the earth. And then, from the center of the clearing, the twisted yew tree groaned. It was not a sound of nature, but something far more terrible, like an ancient being awakening from a deep, unholy slumber. The roots of the tree shuddered, cracking through the frozen earth. In a horrifying display, the tree's bark seemed to split open, revealing a dark void, a black, endless hole, like a gateway to the underworld. And from that hole came them, the Taken. The villagers' screams shattered the stillness of the clearing. echoing through the woods. Figures dressed in tattered red cloaks, faces obscured by wooden masks, stepped forward from the darkness within the tree, their movements unnatural, jerking like marionettes. Each one carried something, a twisted branch, a shard of bone, an object stained with dark, coagulated blood. They moved toward Edvard, circling him like vultures around their prey. They spoke in unison, a voice like wind through the branches of a dead tree, an eerie chant that echoed in Edvard's mind. The debt is paid, the blood is given, the soul is taken. Edvard stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest, the blood dripping steadily from his hand, pooling on the ground at his feet. The Red Father extended his hand, palm up, his fingers curled as if beckoning Edvard to offer more. The villagers behind him were shaking, terror written across their faces. They had not expected this, not truly, but they knew now. They knew what Edvard had done. Edvard's vision blurred, his mind screamed to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there and let this unfold. But the Red Father's power was overwhelming. Edvard's body felt heavy, like lead. His limbs were stiff and numb, his mind clouded with an unnatural fog. The world seemed to tilt and sway, and his breath came in shallow gasps. And then, the Red Father's voice cut through the haze, sharp and commanding. "It is time," the Red Father intoned. The ground beneath Edvard's feet cracked open even further, and from the depths of the hole in the earth, an unearthly scream echoed, a soul trapped in the void, a wail of pure agony. Edvard's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, his hands pressing into the darkened snow. His blood soaked into the earth, mixing with the ancient curse that had long been buried beneath the yew tree. The Red Father's gaze locked onto Edvard, his eyes now burning with an unholy fire. "It is done," the Red Father said. Edvard closed his eyes, the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of the bargain pressing on him like an unbearable burden. And then, with a single cruel motion, the Red Father's hand reached forward. Edvard's scream was the last sound to pierce the storm. The storm raged through the night, but by morning it had passed. The village was quiet, too quiet. The sun struggled to break through the clouds, casting a pale, sickly light over the snow-covered ground. The air, once howling with wind and fury, was now unnaturally still. The world felt frozen in place, as if everything had come to a halt. Edvard's body lay in the snow, cold and lifeless, his blood staining the earth beneath him. His sacrifice had been made, and the world had shifted into a new terrifying reality. The Red Father, having claimed what was owed, had disappeared back into the shadows from whence he came. The twisted yew tree had settled into a stillness that felt ancient, unnatural, as if the very earth had taken a deep, mournful breath. The villagers who had witnessed the offering remained at the edge of the clearing, frozen in terror, unable to move. They had seen the unimaginable, but they could not tear their eyes away from the hole in the earth, from the unnatural quiet that now hung over the village like a pall. The air was thick with a sense of finality. There was no joy, no relief, only the cold, suffocating stillness of a promise fulfilled. Marta stood apart from the others, her face a mask of sorrow. She had known this day would come. She had known Edvard's choice would seal their fates. But even she could not have predicted the depth of the emptiness that followed. The others, the ones who had survived the horrors of the night, huddled together in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, their faces pale, eyes wide with the knowledge of what had just transpired. They had come so close to the end, so close to salvation, but now there was nothing left to hold on to. The village, once alive with the sounds of children playing and the smell of freshly baked bread, was now quiet. Death had taken root, but so had something far worse. The Red Father had claimed what he was owed, and now the villagers were left to live with the consequences. But what consequences? None of them had the strength to ask the question. They all knew. They felt it in their bones, in the very air they breathed. A shift had taken place, something irrevocable and deep, something that could never be undone, and they would have to live with it for the rest of their days. Marta turned slowly, her eyes scanning the village. She had no words for the others. There was nothing left to say. The air hung heavy with the unspeakable truth. The sacrifice had been made. The Red Father had taken what he was owed, and now nothing would ever be the same. The villagers knew they were being watched. At first, it was just a sense, a gnawing feeling in the back of their minds, but it grew slowly, relentlessly. Everywhere they went, they could feel it. The weight of eyes upon them, watching their every move, every breath. It was like a presence, an unspoken shadow that lurked just out of sight, waiting. Then, as if the world had finally exhaled, the silence was broken. A child's voice, a small, tremulous laugh echoed from the distance, light and fleeting. It was Anna who had been taken the night before. Anna, whose absence had been felt in every corner of the village, whose face had haunted their dreams. But there she was, standing in the village square, her form indistinct, almost transparent, as though she were a ghost, caught between this world and the next. She turned, smiling, a smile that was both beautiful and unsettling. And then she vanished, like a wisp of smoke, leaving only the lingering echo of her laughter. The villagers stood in frozen shock. The cold air seemed to thicken around them, and for a moment, time seemed to pause again, hanging in a moment of horror. They knew what had happened. The bargain wasn't just paid. It wasn't just the blood of Edvard. It was the souls of the children, of all the innocent lives that had been taken by the Red Father, now bound to his hunger forever. The sacrifice had not only fulfilled the Red Father's demands, it had changed them. Those taken were not truly gone. They were lost to the Red Father's will, trapped in an endless cycle of servitude. Their souls twisted and bound to the cursed yew tree, feeding his endless hunger. But their presence did not stop there. The villagers began to see more figures, more faces they had thought lost, now walking the streets, their eyes vacant, their bodies stiff and unnatural, like dolls pulled by invisible strings. Their movements were jerky, as though they were puppets, their voices distant and hollow, but they were there among the living, walking the roads that Edvard had once walked. In the church, the altar where Edvard had once stood, his words full of hope and faith, was now silent. The cross that had once symbolized the strength of their faith now cast an unsettling shadow, as though the very church was under the Red Father's curse. The survivors did not speak of the faces they saw in the streets. They did not speak of the cold, distant laughter that followed them as they moved through their daily tasks. They could no longer bring themselves to pray, to sing, to gather in any way that once brought comfort. The curse was no longer just an ancient myth. It was real, and it was all around them. Marta stood alone in the church now, gazing at the empty pews, her hands clasped in front of her. She had witnessed the horror before, but never like this. Never with such a weight of inevitability. For the first time in many years, she wept, the tears falling silently down her worn face. She had been the keeper of the village's old ways, the one who had known the true cost of their existence. She had tried to warn them all, and now it was too late. The calm was not a peace. It was a lie, a suffocating, choking lie. The Red Father's hunger would never be sated. It would never end, and the village would never be free. The village had become a place frozen in time. It was the same, yet not. The snow still covered the fields, blanketing the ground in a pristine, icy sheet. The houses stood tall, their chimneys puffing faint trails of smoke into the gray sky. The small wooden church, once full of life and hope, now loomed dark and silent, its bell no longer ringing on Sundays. The villagers moved about their business as they had before, farming, cooking, tending to the few animals that had survived the harsh winter. But the air was different now. Heavier, the weight of a year gone by pressed on their shoulders, and yet no one spoke of the darkness that had passed over them. They didn't need to, the price had been paid, and the Red Father's presence lingered in the village like a specter, a dark stain that nothing could cleanse. Marta stood in the village square watching the villagers go about their daily tasks, their faces empty, their eyes hollow. They were still the same people, the same faces she had known for years, But they were not. They moved like automatons, their actions mechanical and distant. The children, once full of laughter and play, were now eerily quiet, their games lacking the joy they once had. They no longer smiled. They no longer cried. They only existed. It had been 1 full year since the offering. 1 full year since Edvard had made his terrible choice. Marta had never left the village. She couldn't. Where would she go? What was there beyond the reach of the Red Father's curse? The villagers had all tried to flee in their own ways, but it was as though the land itself had turned against them. The woods, once a place of mystery, were now a prison, a place where time seemed to lose its meaning. Some had tried to leave in the dead of night, but they never came back. The storm that had raged the night of Edvard's death had never fully passed, and those who ventured beyond the forest never returned. And yet, they couldn't bring themselves to speak of it. They didn't need to. No one spoke of the next year. They couldn't. What was there to say? The souls of the taken children, Anna, Linnea, Gunnar, Sophie, and all the others, still wandered the village, their faces appearing at windows, their voices calling from the woods, their footsteps heard on silent nights. They were not truly gone, not like the others, not like the ones who had perished before the offering had been made. The children had become part of the Red Father's dark harvest, their spirits forever bound to the cursed earth beneath the yew tree. The villagers had tried to hold on to the memories of those lost, but as time passed, even the memories began to fade. Faces blurred, names forgotten. And in the quiet moments, when the wind howled through the empty streets and the snow piled high, it was as if the village itself was a ghost. Marta had seen the change in them all. It was not just their empty eyes or the quiet way they moved. It was something deeper, a hollowness that no amount of prayer or work could fill. The village was dying, piece by piece, slowly and quietly. The earth beneath their feet had become corrupted, poisoned by the Red Father's hunger. Crops no longer grew as they once had. The animals were sickly, their flesh thin and frail. The church, the last symbol of their faith, had begun to decay. It had all happened so subtly, so slowly that no one noticed until it was too late. The life had been drained from the land, and with it, the village's very soul. Marta walked through the village square, her footsteps leaving tracks in the thick snow, her breath visible in the frigid air. Her heart ached with the weight of what had happened, the loss of a community, the loss of the very spirit that had once bound them together. She had tried to comfort them, to guide them, to find a way to break the curse. But the Red Father's presence was too powerful. His influence had spread far deeper than anyone had realized. It wasn't just the land that had been poisoned, it was their hearts. It was their belief. The villagers had once prayed for redemption, for forgiveness, but now there was no hope left. There was no salvation. Marta paused before the church, staring up at the tall, crumbling structure. The windows were dark, the doors sealed shut. It was as if the church itself was retreating into the earth, hiding from the truth it could no longer deny. And then, she heard it. The soft, distant laugh. It was Anna's laugh, a child's laugh, high-pitched and light. But there was something wrong about it. Something cold. Something mocking. Marta turned, her heart racing. She had heard it before. The child appeared before her. Anna, standing in the middle of the square, her face pale and vacant. Her once bright eyes were now black pits, endless voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. She was smiling, or at least it looked like a smile, though it was more of a twisted grimace. Her small hands were stretched wide, fingers too long, too thin. "Marta," the girl said in a voice that was both familiar and alien. It was Anna's voice, but it echoed with a strange distortion. "It's almost time." Marta's blood ran cold. She tried to speak, to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as if the earth itself was weighing her down. "Time?" Marta whispered, her throat dry. "Time for what?" Anna tilted her head, the movement too fluid, too unnatural. "For the next offering, for the next year, for the next soul." The child's laugh rang out again, echoing through the village like a death knell. Marta stumbled back, her feet slipping in the snow. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her heart was beating so loudly, she could hardly hear the wind that had started to pick up again, swirling the snow into a frenzy. "The next offering," Anna whispered, her voice now just a breath on the wind. "The next will be yours." The world tilted, and for a moment, Marta could see it. The Red Father's dark, endless gaze staring at her from the shadows. His power was everywhere, suffocating, consuming. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, Anna vanished, disappearing into the swirling storm, leaving only the sound of the wind in her wake. Marta stood alone in the square, her chest tight, the weight of the curse pressing down on her. It would never end. The bargain was made. The Red Father's hunger could never be sated. And so they would wait. They would endure. For another year, and another. The curse would not break. The harvest would continue. It was only a matter of time before the next offering would be demanded.